On my right and your left, Peter Thiel started PayPal along with Reed. They were once on the same team. Back in the 1990s, Peter led PayPal as chief executive officer, took it public in 2002. Peter also started the Thiel Fellowship, which encourages young people like many of you to put, as he says, learning before schooling.
A writing guide at Purdue University, accredited school, apparently, tells students to avoid words like mailman and mankind in order to have, quote, non-sexist, non-biased writing.
And this really has to do with the fact that Silicon Valley itself is not polarized. I mean, if only there was some polarization here, one could say the same, incidentally, about universities, but there's an almost total lack of it. In fact, you have, as a number of questioners have pointed out, a very liberal culture.
So doesn't that mean that a small group of super unhappy people get to control what the rest of us say and think?
Well, perhaps they're ahead of their time. Maybe this is something that is offending a small group, but the group's going to get larger, and times are changing, and our language is dynamic. Webster keeps adding new words in the dictionary, so our language needs to change. And a term that used to be non-offensive, like man-made and mailman, now needs to be changed.
And it's always hard to know, exactly where you'd draw that line. My own sense is that it's wildly on the wrong side. Are we sort of at the end of history, which is sort of the liberal conceit, where we know all the basic answers, we know what's right, there are few people who are retrograde, they're bad, they're going to die soon, versus are there still a lot of things that we just don't know? I think the mistake, in my judgment, would be that we're constantly getting to there's a right answer that and you get to the right answer very quickly. And my view would be that on many topics, the answers aren't clearly right. They're not clearly right on globalization. They're not clearly right on any of these issues. And so I think to get to the truth, we need a broader debate because I think we are more wrong than we think.
Today in the Nexus, we are looking at how George Soros and other powerful people are trying to influence the way we think and vote. Unlike many donors, Soros is quite open about his political donations and is a major contributor to the US Democrats. Take a look at what's happening in the United States. He spent $26 million trying to put Democrats, including Hillary Clinton, into office in 2016, another $5 million to Barack Obama's first presidential campaign back in 2008, another $2 million to groups associated with his 2012 election bid, and going back even further, he spent big against George W. Bush, giving a total of $25 million to groups and candidates that opposed him, and that was back in 2000 and 2004. Now, he's supposed to be a Democrat, Kevin, but the truth is, he can be a Democrat if it's one man, one vote, or one person, one vote, but really his voice is in proportion to his money.
But you understand, aside from that kind of popular culture that sings the songs and tells the story and dreams the dreams, there are extremely powerful men and even families who have been working earnestly, investing deeply in this for a very long time. Whether we're talking about the Rockefellers or the Morgans or the Rothschilds who crafted our Federal Reserve System, which, whether you realize it or not, was a big way for them to control both national and international economies, which was really their biggest desire by being able to control the flow of money and flow of the interest rates. The second one is George Soros, who is also basically Hungarian, who moved to England. He has arrest warrants in both England and France for crashing their economies. He's a multi-billionaire who funds over 300 organizations that are committed in the United States. He's given 300 organizations to which he's already dedicated over $30 million to help turn over democracy in America because he thinks it's wrong. In other words, things like Black Lives Matter is funded by George Soros, along with scores of others. When they show up someplace, you see these spontaneous riots. These are not spontaneous riots. These are people who are organized or paid for and funded by George Soros or one of his shadow organizations. He doesn't like the United States. He doesn't believe we're a good thing.
Look at Soros's bigger project, his Open Society Foundation. It's a huge network. Let's have a look. Look, it's headquartered there in New York and has channeled $38 billion to over 100 countries since being set up in 1979. Now, the foundation's stated mission is to build vibrant and tolerant societies whose governments are accountable and open to the participation of all people. It mostly focuses on lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, migrant and women's rights.
Why would somebody pursue this? And there probably are many reasons you could assign to the people who are involved in it. I mean, I think greed is a big part of it that has really enriched. As we talk about the growth of the 1%, we have to understand that it is because, in large part, of the kind of machinations that have led to this world organization that has funneled the resources into the hands and the pockets of these smaller and smaller group of people. In fact, today, that over half of the assets in the world are owned by 80 families. 80 families own half of the material assets that exist in the world today. And how does this happen? Well, it happens through many of these kind of trade agreements and banking agreements, the idea of creating large national banks that are controlled by a handful of individuals, and it's given them the capacity to control. They too have positioned themselves in an economic place where everything has to flow in and out of them. And we're going to see when we talk about one world economy, this is growing even closer as the banking system of the world is now beginning to collaborate and putting together a blockchain system like Bitcoin that will eliminate Bitcoin and all of the other contenders and make it so that you cannot buy or sell unless you use their cryptocurrency. That many countries are moving away from cash. Even Israel is planning within the next year to eliminate cash currency and go to cryptocurrency.
Silicon Valley, his kingdom, and Bitcoin, a source of his riches.
Are you a millionaire?
Yes, many times over.
Bitcoin.
Bitcoin, the cryptocurrency.
Bitcoin. It's the digital currency. You've probably heard something about at this point.
Every time you use your Bitcoin, that transaction is recorded in a public digital ledger called the blockchain.
The blockchain offers is really a revolutionary approach to security that has been all but unhackable.
Check the ledger.
Bitcoin is the world's most popular cryptocurrency. It's a digital currency that you could use like cash, but unlike other currencies, it isn't backed by any government. You don't keep it in a bank or carry it in your pocket. It exists solely online. You can use it to get a hotel room on Expedia, buy furniture on Overstock, or in theory, pay someone directly for a cup of coffee.
Bitcoin has experienced an astronomical rise in value.
But one of the things I think that people don't talk about, and of course with the rage of Bitcoins right now, is that Bitcoins were ostensibly created for the purpose of serving the financial requirements of the dark web. It became a way of selling drugs on things like Silk Road or selling people in sexual slavery. You could carry on these exchanges without having to use money or use banking systems, and it was just an independent system. Now it's beginning to come into the mainstream.
There's no question cryptocurrency has crossed over into the mainstream.
A far cry from its dark past. Bitcoin once the preferred currency to buy drugs and other illicit items on the black market site Silk Road. The FBI eventually shutting down Silk Road, seizing over 173,000 Bitcoins, which would be worth over $1.5 billion today.
But what it really does, as one observer noted, it allows governments central control of money supply and proper payment of tax. You see, if you have a digital system and everything operates in a digital system, and the government sits on top of that digital system, there can no longer be an economic system, a black market system that isn't part of the system.
But then the more you learn about the history of money, the more you realize it's perfectly sound. Look at the US dollar. It's backed by our faith in the government to act in our economic best interest.
Well, it's backed by our faith in the government, that it's a sound government and that there's an economy and a structure behind it.
That makes total sense if you live in the United States or the EU or even China probably. But if you're in Venezuela, the value of your dollar there drops exponentially each and every day. Bitcoin makes a whole lot of sense.
Let me tell you, I know of a lot of people in our own River City who do this on a regular basis, who have lived for years off the grid economically because they do everything in cash payments. What happens when that cash payment isn't worth anything? What happens?
Cash seems to be a thing of the past for a whole lot of people.
You got that right. Speed and convenience has many of you turning to mobile payment systems like Venmo, Apple Pay, and Google Wallet. You've told me about it.
All the time. Tonight, Joanne Burton is taking a look at the impacts digital dollars are having on our kids.
And I suddenly realized in that moment, the dollar bill is really nothing more than a piece of paper if it's not agreed that it has value. Well, in one way, the entire economic system of the world is what we call now a fiat currency. And a fiat currency means we all agree to honor it, but it has no value behind it. This is the problem. The minute people perceive money not having value, they no longer use it, or they no longer honor it, and they no longer accept it. And that can happen very, very quickly. So governments work very, very hard to ensure that people have confidence in their currency. That's what a lot of the management of the Federal Reserve Bank and other things do, is managing our currency, is to convince people that it has value and it has worth. Although in reality, it's all just simply an agreement. I'm going to give you my dollars, and you're going to give me services and goods in exchange, and we just agree that this is a more convenient medium of transaction. So that today, less than 15% of the currency that we operate on actually exists in real physical form. In other words, 85% of the dollars are digits already. They're already digits, that's all they are. Banks transfer money, they just transfer digital registers, they have digital ledgers going between them. There are some, and I don't know if this is true, who are basically saying Bitcoin was created by the NSA, and they have the backdoor keys, and they know how to access it. But here's the biggest thing. Even if none of that is true, here's what's really fascinating. We're moving into the age of what's called quantum computing. Now, I was listening to one guy talking about the security of Bitcoin and saying, don't worry about it. It'll be 15 years before quantum computing is even online. And we're already working on quantum computing Bitcoins that will be able to resist quantum computing hacks and so forth and so on. That was in June when I was listening to his presentation. 2 weeks ago, Intel said, we've just come out with a new quantum computing chip that can fit into a laptop. Now, what does quantum computing do? Quantum computing moves at such an incredible speed that one computer can run the entire Internet things, the Internet of everything in the whole world at one time.
Imagine a computer that could crack the world's most secure codes in minutes, design extraordinary new medicines, even pave the way to intelligent machines. Big tech companies like Google, IBM, and Microsoft are all trying to be the first to achieve a breakthrough in the field of quantum computing. But, well, we're not quite there yet. At the moment, if you want a quantum computer, you need all of this. You need your ionizing lasers, your cooling lasers, and your processor. You need all of this, and currently, all this can do is add a 0 and a 1. But it does do it in a really cool way. Quantum computers harness weird and wonderful phenomena seen only at very small scales. The data in an ordinary computer is represented as bits, each of which can either be 0 or 1. A quantum computer instead uses quantum bits or qubits. Now these qubits can be both 0 and 1 at the same time. This is called superposition, and it's a key feature of a quantum computer's unique powers. So when a quantum computer adds a 0 and a 1, it's also adding a 1 and a 0, and a 1 and a 1 and a 0 and a 0, all at the same time. So number crunching could, in theory, be done much faster on a quantum computer.
Someone illustrated this way, that a traditional computer, if you put an X on a page, say page 360 on a 500-page book, and you gave it to a computer and said, find the X, it would start at page 1 and go all the way until it got to page 360 and say, oh, there's the X. But it would have to process page by page by page by page. Quantum computing, it computes, uses atoms. It's an atomic level computation. And you give it that same book, and it looks at the entire book all at once and immediately says, it's on page 360. Just like that. It's an amazing growth, as I said, this tsunami of information.
And then there's code breaking. If you give an ordinary computer a code to break, it will try every possible combination one at a time. But give a quantum computer a code to break, and it can try all the codes at once.
This is a huge area of application of quantum computers, and it's really financially the driving force in putting money into the industry and persuading people to really try to build these things. The first government which has a functional quantum computer which can break into secret messages is going to be at a big advantage, and maybe we want to try and hide away the fact that they've got those capabilities.
And if superposition wasn't weird enough, a quantum computer's qubits can be paired up or entangled, and then can instantaneously affect each other from anywhere else in the universe.
Allowing us to build a large-scale quantum computer is tremendously hard. Quantum effects, like that an atom can be at two different places at the same time, or entanglement, what Einstein referred to as spooky, these are just so hard to control.
Because when I talked about earlier about quantum computing, will bring a capacity for communications beyond anything we know, and it'll bring it down to the level of easy manageability. 5G technology, which is a new generation of cell phones, most of us are 4G, you'll go to 5G technology. That was way off in the future. I just read last night, they're going to release phones with 5G technology, SIM cards, next year. Now the value of this is a 5G runs 100 times faster than your current phone. So that when you're doing a search for something on your phone, it's going to be delivered to you 100 times faster than you currently can download that information. Another cell phone technology called P-Cell is in development right now, creating a ubiquitous Wi-Fi system that no matter where you are, you can stay connected 24/7, 7 days a week, all over the world, all the time, no matter where you are. You're connected and you're also surveilled. In other words, we are seeing things move at such a pace that it's staggering.
But Yuval Harari has written two very important books which have really shaped the debate, not just inside governments, but inside many businesses and many non-governmental organizations too. What he's going to be talking about today is something that actually Chancellor Merkel touched on in her own speech, which is a question of data. And what do we do about data today? His ideas are very provocative, very alarming, and something that all of you should pay very close attention to now. Professor Harari, Professor Yuval, the floor is yours.
Now, how exactly will the future masters of the planet look like? This will be decided by the people who own the data. Those who control the data control the future not just of humanity, but the future of life itself. Because today, data is the most important asset in the world. Because unlike land and unlike machinery, data is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It can move at the speed of light, and you can create as many copies of it as you want. So does the data about my DNA, my brain, my body, my life, does it belong to me, or to some corporation, or to the government, or perhaps to the human collective? At present, big corporations are holding much of the data, and people are becoming worried about it. But mandating governments to nationalize the data may curb the power of the big corporations only in order to give rise to digital dictatorships.
The things that developers are saying are, well, we'll develop in 10 years or 15 years, are beginning to hit the markets within 2 to 3 and 4 years. And the biggest challenge is which one's going to win out, because there's multiple developers who are working all of these things at the same time. And who knows? Because they recognize they can become extremely wealthy, even more wealthier than they are right now. So that right now we have 75 technology companies that are richer than 80% of the nations in the world. That Apple is wealthier than almost every other nation upon the planet, except for the United States. And you realize we have moved from this place of having national sovereignty to now we have corporate sovereignty based upon technological development and revolution.
And if democracy cannot adapt to these new conditions, then humans will come to live under the rule of digital dictatorships. And already at present, we are seeing the formation of more and more sophisticated surveillance regimes throughout the world, not just by authoritarian regimes, but also by democratic governments. The US, for example, is building a global surveillance system, while my home country of Israel is trying to build a total surveillance regime in the West Bank. But control of data might enable human elites to do something even more radical than just build digital dictatorships.
That there are many who believe that what we're heading for, or hope that what we're heading for, is a brave new world. The people who are behind the technocratic developments, who see technocracy as being the new form of government where technocracy will run everything. You can't rely upon politicians anymore.
I mean, it makes 1984 sound positively... Child's play, yeah. Exactly.
And we'll have systems in place that will guarantee that everything is fair and just and so forth. They talk about this brave new world that we are coming into, but the Bible describes it not as that. It describes it more as a brutal and evil version of the old world. That it's evil on steroids. It's evil in hypersonic space and time. The question that most of us would have is, how close are we? And I'll be again honest, I can't answer that question.
Right. Now, you're unusual because you actually stood up on that stage and you said, I don't know what the answer is. Okay, that's not something you hear a lot at the World Economic Forum. It's admirably humble. But I'm curious, as you look around the world today, do you see any countries or any groups of people or any academic groups that seem to be having a sensible debate about this? Do you see any reason for encouragement at all?
Well, I think the world is divided into a very, very small group of people and institutions who understand what is happening and what is at stake, and the vast majority, not just of ordinary people, but even of politicians and business people who are not really, yes, they hear about data, data protection, there are cyber attacks, somebody might steal my identity or my bank account details, but that, as I said, it's just the tip of the iceberg.
I could go on to talking about terrorism and the threats and how that's been used to justify literally a technological takeover of our lives, but I'm way out of time. Not that you mind. But I want to begin by saying we have to realize that the real motivation behind the globalist efforts is not only those personally driven by the individuals who are part of it, and they stand to gain from it. They stand to gain. They become really like kings over the rest of us, and we're reduced into a life of pauperhood and submission that's expressed itself even in our own community in ways that most people don't even recognize. It governs, it drives agendas even in your city councils and county commissioners and the decisions they make, state government laws that restrict this and restrict that. You see, the only power of a bureaucrat is to say no. There's no power in saying yes, and so they create more and more laws to tell you no, 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 no. And at the end of the day, it's to remove from you the freedom to make your own choices. But I think it's important for us to understand not just that this is such a terrible injustice, because it is, but more importantly, it's a sign of the times. It's an indication that we are moving increasingly towards what the Bible said would be this one world government dominated by one evil ruler. So much more to say.
Ah, the streets of San Francisco. Mecca for technology innovators and aficionados. A destination where the cult of geek reigns supreme. Everyone's got that billion-dollar idea here, and everyone wants to save the world. The ethos, nothing is impossible, runs through the veins and the Twitter feeds of every 20-something Zuckerberg wannabe. Now, Silicon Valley is taking on life's biggest challenge: death.
Dave Lee has been looking at how Silicon Valley is trying to help us all live longer.
This all-important question about the nature of the progress of our society, we have a sort of learned helplessness with respect to it. And we have to figure out some way to be able to think about these things more effectively.
The tech industry has gotten away with whatever they want to do. Government has been completely missing in action. I mean, we know how dysfunctional Washington, D.C. is in general.
Right.
On this issue, missing in action for over a decade.
Because it's hard to know. I mean, with technology, it grows in leaps and bounds.
It does.
And for politicians,
well, I disagree.
catching up
No,
or even...
politicians are owned by the tech industry. That's the truth.
That's
No, they've
also
been, let's be honest.
But do they understand what the ownership entails?
They do one thing. Here's what they understand. They understand they're getting large contributions from tech companies, and no, they do not understand the technology the way Tristan does.
You know, two of the areas of tech that people are very excited about in Silicon Valley today are crypto on the one hand and AI on the other. Crypto's decentralizing, AI is centralizing. Or if you want to frame it, more ideologically, you could say that crypto is libertarian and AI is communist. And of course, we always hear only the first half because we're biased to the left. But AI is communist in the sense that it's about big data. It's about big governments controlling all the data, knowing more about you than you know about yourself.
Some of the big corporations, like Google, like Facebook, the usual suspects, they understand what is at stake. I also think that some governments, especially the Chinese government, I think they understand what is at stake.
And if you look at the Chinese Communist Party, it loves AI and hates crypto, so it actually fits pretty closely on that level.
I mean, China is interesting because I remember sitting at a table a few years ago in Davos with a senior Chinese official and we were arguing about democracy, and he said, well, you in the West have democracy, we have social media. And the point was that Chinese government is using social media to not just monitor its citizens, but also act as a weather vane to gather information about what's happening in terms of public sentiment and ensure that they stay 1 inch ahead of that to stop any explosions.
The Chinese are moving ahead with a technologically controlled nation at a pace beyond anybody else. They really have it. And they're putting or cameras up everywhere for surveillance. And one of their cities, Shenzhen, which is kind of their Silicon Valley, if you will, is a population of 7 million people. And to prove how great their surveillance was, they took a BBC journalist and they drove him into the middle of the city and said, get out of your car and go anywhere you want, and we'll see how long it takes us to locate and apprehend you. And so they gave him 30 minutes just to mingle in with the crowds and the peoples and go wherever he wants. And then they turned their cameras on. It took him 2 minutes to locate him, and he was apprehended in 7. And you see, this is increasingly the direction where all of this is going. And that's why I'm saying, when you talk about the development of the technology and the way that other countries are studying it and embracing it, you realize that this is has great potential for good. It has great potential for evil. We'll get into it some more detail in a minute here. You see, it's important for us to realize, and this is really why I share a lot of this stuff, not just to simply sensationalize you or terrorize you, as some people have said, but we're entering a world like we've never known, that has never ever been foreseen or known before outside of the Bible. In other words, what John is writing about here in chapter 13 is something that people would have said, well, that's science fiction, that's wild speculation. But how does a man who is imprisoned on the Isle of Patmos, living in a cave by himself in exile at the age of 90 plus years, sit down and write all this stuff down that people would understandably say, boy, you know, he must have found some magic mushrooms in that cave and he's just kind of having wild delusions. And here we are 2,000 years later going, how did he know?
Well, it's time for a rather unconventional shopping experience. The first thing I'm going to do is get my bag out.
I visited this North London convenience store where IBM have been putting their prototype instant checkout to the test.
Because when it comes to actually checking out, the RFID tags that sit on all the products will be instantly scanned in one go.
For customers who are happy to share their habits and behaviour, artificial intelligence will come into play to combine that information with data on their surroundings.
But what they're trying to do is convince us to use our smartphones as digital wallets. And which is exactly what they're doing in China today. In fact, today, over 80% of all payments, according to the Asian Times, are made by people's smartphones. I mean, all of that is designed for what purpose? It's to convince us that this is the direction which we should go. But again, Inga Beale, who is the CEO of Lloyd's, said at that same Davos conference that I referenced earlier, she said, for many people, the smartphone is the first and only computer they will have. The smartphone. Now, what's significant to that is not that smartphones are smarter than I are, because they are, but because we're seeing the miniaturizing of the transmission method. It's getting smaller and smaller, and will get even smaller. The question is, why are they really doing it? And as I said, they ostensibly want to tell us, well, we can stop crime, we can stop terrorism, we can stop corruption.
To understand our shopping habits from the moment we enter a shop until we leave, Accenture has kitted out this Milan store, which they've dubbed the supermarket of the future. It features e-ink display price tags and a lot of screens. Hidden behind them are Kinect depth sensing cameras, collecting data on customers' movements and interactions with products. The designers of the space hope that as well as providing insight to the retailer, the data collection will better the overall shopping experience. But whilst most of us are still actually engaging with humans or the self-service aisle, it seems that the cashierless shop could be coming to a place near you fairly soon.
That was Lara. Now, we've been looking at various ways to try and extend human life, possibly indefinitely. But the researchers can't do it yet. And so until they can, there are those who are offering to put your life on pause.
Kristen Brown is a biotechnology journalist. She tells me living longer is becoming something of an obsession for many techies.
We do tend to see people not just thinking of the body as a machine, but talking about it metaphorically as a machine.
Are they actually making any progress?
It's growing so quickly right now. I mean, we understand so much more this year than we did last year even. But the other thing about science is the more questions you answer, the more questions there are.
Death and taxes, as the saying goes, are the two things that none of us can avoid. But what about if there was a workaround for death, some way of extending our physical existence on this planet?
To gather this data, they have set up a partnership to get the blood plasma from Grifols, a major pharmaceutical firm based in Spain. People are being paid to give up their young blood.
Well, that's a fascinating ethical question.
But there's something else that's involved here when we try to understand motivation, something that we tend to overlook. And that's what Paul spoke of, and he says, they will come under a powerful delusion. He's telling us that there's a supernatural influence. He called it the work of Satan, a secret power of lawlessness. The secret power of lawlessness basically says God is not a factor. Every man governs his own life. We set our own destiny. And at the heart of this whole philosophy is a religious or philosophical belief that the Bible is outdated and all religious systems are too restrictive and are archaic, and we need to replace it with a new view of reality based upon man being the center of all things. And as they look into the future, they're saying, we have to not only shape and form the world, but we need to save it from itself. There is a messianic complex here. And when he uses this word powerful delusion, the word powerful, or anakia in the Greek, literally is only used in the New Testament in one way: supernatural power. Supernatural power. There's a demonic force that is convincing them and is deluding them. And I love even the word delude. It's more than just being deceived. It's the belief that you maintain despite contradictions of the real world all around you, even though it contradicts rational arguments. And we sit back and you and I will say, well, how in the world are they going to convince the rest of us to sign on to this whole concept if it's irrational and we can just look at the reality of it and say, this doesn't make any sense. It's kind of like the issue of global warming. I mean, I just have to look outside and say, please, let it start. But the answer is really simple. And we'll get into talking about this later on, about the new religious called scientism, where science becomes ultimately the spiritual authority in people's lives, or science falsely so called. The word lawlessness means basically disregard of God's law. The idea that God is God and that God has a moral and ethical standard that he expects mankind to be governed by. Excuse me, a kind of amorality based upon man being the center of his universe. It's the idea of humanism. That humanism essentially asserts that man is the center of all things. We are the definer, the decider of what's good and right, which is increasingly becoming the underlying philosophical foundation of our world. And he says that's what this idea of the man of lawlessness, he'll be this one who's saying, you don't have to regard God. God is no longer a pertinent factor because in a sense we all are God in our own very, very little way. But he says that man will be revealed, the one who will be the forefront, the poster child, if you will, of this whole concept. And he says he's a man who is doomed to destruction. But he will oppose and exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God.
Alcor doesn't have any legal obligation to the people stored here, as they've technically donated their bodies to science, and that it has 1,150 people signed up for its services, including Silicon Valley billionaire Peter Thiel.
I think the question I'd want to leave for people here is to come back to this question of the nature of scientific and technological progress. It's a question that's, I think, an all-important cultural, social, political question. What is the truth about it? Are we in fact in a society that's, with a few signal exceptions, broadly stagnating? I think there's a sense in which I would say science, philosophy, religion, these are much more important than politics. And so heterodoxy in those fields, having genuine debates in those fields, is much more important than a diversity in politics.
That's kind of where a lot of people go with this kind of stuff, and people get kind of worked up. The point is that it's happening at a pace that is so exponential, so tsunami-like, that we just need to understand there has never been a time like this in the history of the world. And never has there been a time where it seems to be coalescing around the very things that the Bible said would be the events of the end times. So my real hope in all of this is twofold, why I'm doing this whole series. Number one is I want you to take your Bible seriously. Too many Christians don't. Too many Christians don't take it seriously. I want you to take it seriously. I want you to recognize that it is, in every word, the inspired testimony of God, both of history, the present, and even speaking of the future. Don't put your heart on those things. Don't make that the purpose of your life. When you're younger, you're driven to get the education, get the job, and then you find out that degree in poetry won't get you anything except a barista job. But we get driven to these sort of things and we throw our lives into them, and then one day we realize that we've climbed to the top of the ladder and the ladder's on the wrong wall. No, it's important that we live ourselves purposely. The illustration that came to me last night as I was contemplating all these things was when God led Israel out of Egypt, and he took them into the wilderness, and he took them for 2 years to prepare them so that they could go up and they could inherit the land of the promise. But because of unbelief, because they didn't believe God's word, they didn't take God's word seriously, that whole generation spent the next 38 years, additional years, 40 years in the wilderness, and they died off, and God raised up a new generation who would believe him. And my concern is that we have so many people who profess faith in Christ, but they don't believe his word, and it's evident because they don't base their choices and decisions upon what God has said. They're relying upon their own opinions, their own perspectives, or how it looks to me at this point in time. And I learned long ago that I'm dumb, dense, and stupid, that I am, an idiot. Maybe I'm an evolved idiot, but I'm still an idiot. And I don't know what even tomorrow is going to bring. As Peter said, what is your life? It's a vapor that appears for a moment and it's gone. What do you know about anything that's coming? All I know is that Jesus is coming. Amen. And I want to orient my life. I want to point my life. I want the trajectory of my life to be pursuing him and seeking after him. Because ultimately that's what I was created for in the beginning anyway.